There comes a moment in the life of a nation when the world suddenly realizes that the country it once dismissed has stopped asking for permission to survive. For decades, Burkina Faso was treated as another fragile African state trapped between poverty, foreign debt, and endless dependency. The global financial system expected Ouagadougou to remain in the same position forever, weak enough to obey, poor enough to depend, desperate enough to accept whatever conditions arrived, attached to foreign money. But something has changed. Today, the World Bank is expanding more than 27 projects across Burkina Faso, with total commitments approaching $4.18 billion. That number alone is enough to make global financial observers pay attention. But the real story is not the money. The real story is how Captain IbrahimTraore is using international financing in a way that completely breaks the old African script. This is not the Burkina Faso of yesterday. This is a nation trying to transform foreign capital into national independence instead of permanent dependence. Traore is not standing before the world with his hands stretched out, begging for survival. He is negotiating from a position built on sovereignty, control, and long-term national ambition. And that is exactly why the conversation around Burkina Faso has become so uncomfortable for parts of the West. If you believe Africa deserves the right to shape its own destiny, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because today we are diving into one of the most important political and economic transformations happening anywhere in the Pan-African world right now. For years, Burkina Faso existed inside a system that many Africans quietly believed was designed to keep countries weak. For generations, the people of Burkina Faso watched their country export gold, cotton, and raw materials while importing debt, dependency, and economic humiliation. Foreign corporations entered the country with promises of development, but too often the wealth extracted from Burkinabe soil disappeared into offshore accounts and foreign markets long before ordinary citizens ever saw the benefits. This was the old cycle that trapped much of Africa for decades. Governments borrowed heavily from international institutions. Conditions followed every loan. State industries were weakened. Strategic sectors were opened to outside control. Public services struggled, while debt payments continued rising year after year. Burkina Faso became known internationally as a country surviving on aid, instead of a nation capable of building its own future. Many young people lost faith completely. Some dreamed only of leaving the country. Others believed real economic power could never belong to African nations, because the global system had already been designed against them. Then Ibrahim Traore arrived and changed the national mood almost overnight. What made Traore different was not simply his speeches against dependency. Africa has heard speeches before. The difference was the tone. He spoke less like a politician asking the world for sympathy, and more like a leader announcing that Burkina Faso intended to renegotiate its place inside the international system. Under his leadership, the language coming from Ouagadougou began to shift. Burkina Faso would still cooperate with international institutions, but cooperation would no longer mean surrender. Foreign investment would be accepted, but national sovereignty would come first. The country would no longer define success by how much aid it received, but by how much control it regained over its own future. That psychological transformation may be the most important change of all, because nations do not become independent the moment money arrives. They become independent the moment they stop believing dependency is permanent. The reason the World Bank continues expanding its presence inside Burkina Faso is not because the country suddenly became politically convenient. In many ways, Burkina Faso has become far more unpredictable for the traditional global order. Yet, despite growing tensions with parts of the West, the World Bank now maintains more than 27 active projects in the country with commitments approaching $4.18 billion. That reality tells us something extremely important. Burkina Faso is no longer being treated as a passive aid recipient. It has become strategically impossible to ignore. The projects currently financed by the World Bank touch nearly every critical area of national development: energy infrastructure, agriculture, education, healthcare, transportation, and social services are all receiving major support. Even more significant, Burkina Faso has managed to maintain a disbursement rate higher than the regional average despite serious security and political challenges. Under ordinary circumstances, international financial institutions become cautious when a country adopts strong nationalist policies or openly criticizes dependency on foreign powers. But Burkina Faso, under Ibrahim Traore, has forced a different calculation. The Sahel region has become one of the most geopolitically sensitive regions in the world. Western influence is weakening. French military presence has collapsed across several countries. Anti-colonial sentiment is rising among younger African populations. And in the middle of all these changes, Burkina Faso is trying to build a model that combines international financing with stronger national control. The World Bank understands the stakes. If it completely loses influence in Ouagadougou, it risks losing influence across a much wider section of West Africa. That is why cooperation continues even while political tensions grow louder. In many ways, both sides now need each other for very different reasons. Burkina Faso needs financing to modernize its economy. But international institutions also need continued access to a country that may shape the future direction of the entire Sahel region. What truly separates Ibrahim Traore from many leaders before him is not that he rejects international money. It is that he refuses to allow international money to define the future of Burkina Faso. For decades, many African economies operated under a familiar pattern. Governments borrowed billions of dollars, but the structure of those economies barely changed. Roads were built, conferences were held, consultants were paid, and foreign contractors secured enormous profits while local production remained weak. Countries consumed more than they produced and imported more than they manufactured. Traore appears determined to break that cycle. The current strategy emerging from Ouagadougou is centered on using international financing to strengthen domestic capacity instead of deepening foreign dependency. Investments are increasingly directed toward sectors that can help Burkina Faso stand on its own feet in the future. Energy projects are expanding because no country can industrialize in permanent darkness. Agricultural investment is growing because food dependency creates political vulnerability. Technical education and vocational training are being emphasized because nations cannot develop without skilled local workers. Even more important is the growing focus on national control over strategic sectors. Burkina Faso is trying to reduce the old model where raw resources leave Africa cheaply while finished products return at much higher prices. Gold, agriculture, pharmaceuticals, and state-linked industries are all becoming part of a broader conversation about economic sovereignty. This is why the message coming from Traore resonates so strongly across the continent. He is not saying that Africa should isolate itself from the world. He is saying Africa must stop entering global partnerships from a position of permanent weakness. Burkina Faso still needs foreign financing, technology, and international trade. But the leadership in Ouagadougou increasingly wants those relationships to operate on different terms. The goal is no longer survival through dependency. The goal is development through controlled cooperation. And for parts of the old international system, that shift is deeply unsettling. What truly worries parts of the Western political and financial establishment is not simply the money flowing into Burkina Faso. $4.18 billion is significant, but global institutions manage far larger amounts every year. The real concern is the example Burkina Faso may create if this strategy succeeds. Because if a country facing insecurity, poverty, and international pressure can still begin rebuilding national control over its economy, then millions of Africans across the continent will start asking dangerous questions. Why should resource-rich nations remain permanently dependent on foreign expertise? Why should countries exporting gold continue importing poverty? Why should governments surrender control over strategic industries simply to qualify for loans? That is the deeper ideological battle now emerging around Burkina Faso. Critics in the West frequently point to concerns about democracy, media restrictions, and political freedoms under military leadership. Some of those concerns are legitimate. Burkina Faso still faces serious security problems, humanitarian challenges, and governance risks. No honest analysis should ignore those realities. But many Africans also notice something else. The loudest international criticism often seems to intensify whenever African governments begin reclaiming stronger control over natural resources or reducing foreign influence over national policy. That contradiction has fueled growing skepticism across the continent. People are beginning to ask whether some international outrage is truly about protecting democracy, or whether part of it is about protecting economic influence built during decades of unequal relationships. At the same time, Burkina Faso itself carries enormous responsibility. If the government wants to convince Africa that a new path is possible, then it must prove that sovereignty produces real results for ordinary citizens. Roads must improve, electricity must expand, jobs must grow, corruption must decline. Otherwise, the promise of economic liberation could become just another political slogan. The stakes are now far bigger than Burkina Faso alone. What happens in Ouagadougou may influence how an entire generation of Africans thinks about development, power, and independence. The rise of Burkina Faso under Ibrahim Traore carries lessons that extend far beyond one country or one political moment. Across Africa, governments are now watching closely to see whether Ouagadougou can transform bold rhetoric into lasting economic reality. The first lesson is that international financing does not automatically destroy sovereignty. The real issue is how that financing is negotiated and where the money ultimately goes. If loans only increase imports and dependency, countries remain trapped. But if investment strengthens electricity, agriculture, transportation, education, and domestic industry, then outside financing can become a tool for national development rather than permanent control. The second lesson is that resources alone are never enough. Africa has always possessed enormous wealth beneath its soil. What many countries lacked was the political courage and strategic planning required to convert raw materials into national power. Burkina Faso is now trying to use its gold, labor, and infrastructure projects to build stronger internal capacity instead of feeding external systems. The third lesson is that Pan-Africanism must become practical instead of symbolic. Citizens cannot eat speeches. They cannot power hospitals with slogans. A truly independent Africa requires factories, engineers, energy systems, schools, medicines, and functioning institutions that improve everyday life. Traore has changed the conversation because he speaks about sovereignty not only as political freedom, but as economic control. Still, the future remains uncertain. Burkina Faso must prove that discipline, transparency, and competent governance can sustain this new direction over time. If it succeeds, the impact could reach far beyond the borders of the Sahel. And if it fails, Critics will argue that dependency was unavoidable all along. Burkina Faso is still far from perfect. The country continues to battle insecurity, economic pressure, and enormous development challenges. But something historic is unfolding in Ouagadougou that the rest of the world can no longer ignore. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is attempting to engage with global financial institutions without surrendering the right to define its own future. The nearly $4.18 billion connected to World Bank projects no longer symbolizes automatic dependency in the eyes of many supporters of Captain IbrahimTraore. Instead, it has become a test of whether Africa can use international systems without becoming trapped inside them. That is why this moment matters so deeply across the continent. Ibrahim Traore has forced a new conversation inside the Pan-African movement. He has challenged the old assumption that African nations must permanently choose between isolation or submission. Burkina Faso is trying to prove that another path may exist, a path where cooperation serves sovereignty instead of replacing it. Whether this experiment succeeds or fails will shape far more than one nation. It could influence how the African Union, future Pan-Africanism movements, and an entire Africa new generation think about development for decades to come. The world is watching Burkina Faso because the country now represents more than a small Sahel state. It represents a growing demand for dignity, ownership, and self-determination. Captain IbrahimTraore did not simply inherit a crisis. He stepped into a system many Africans believed was designed to keep them permanently dependent. Now, he is trying to rebuild that system from the inside out. And perhaps that is what truly unsettles the old powers most of all. Because once people begin believing they can control their own destiny, it becomes almost impossible to force them back onto their knees. If you enjoyed this video, like, share, and subscribe for more deep discussions on Burkina Faso, Pan-African change, and the future of Africa. For years, Captain IbrahimTraore has been known as the leader standing at the center of Burkina Faso's fight against terrorism. His name has often been associated with military operations, national security, and the effort to restore stability across the country. But in 2026, a different kind of battle is beginning to attract attention. This new battle is not being fought with weapons. It is being fought with knowledge, savings, investment, and economic participation. The Second International African Stock Exchange Fair, known as CBE 2026, has introduced a conversation that goes far beyond finance. At the heart of the event is a simple but powerful question. Who should finance the future of Burkina Faso foreign institutions and outside investors? Or the people of Burkina Faso themselves? Supporters of this vision believe that true sovereignty extends beyond national borders. They argue that a country cannot be fully independent if it depends heavily on external funding to build its future. This is why CBE 2026 has attracted attention as more than a financial gathering. For many observers, it represents a new front in the broader struggle for economic sovereignty. If you enjoy learning about the major transformations shaping Africa today, make sure to subscribe to the channel and follow our future reports. To understand why this idea is gaining momentum, it is important to look at the challenges facing Burkina Faso. Since 2022, the country has devoted significant resources to security and reconstruction efforts. These priorities require substantial funding, yet military victories alone cannot guarantee long-term independence. A nation may secure its territory while remaining financially dependent on others. This reality has led to growing discussions about economic sovereignty, where protecting national interests means not only defending land, but also strengthening the ability to finance development through domestic resources and citizen participation. SIBA 2026 was presented under a simple but highly strategic theme: financial markets and financial inclusion. The central question was equally straightforward. How can the stock market be brought closer to ordinary people? For decades, financial markets across much of Africa have often been viewed as spaces reserved for wealthy investors, large corporations, and financial professionals. Many citizens have never owned a share, purchased a bond, or participated in any formal investment activity. As a result, millions of people save money without ever becoming part of the broader economic growth that their savings could help create. This is precisely the challenge that SIBA 2026 seeks to address. According to the organizers, the objective is not merely to promote stock exchanges. It is to change perceptions. The event aims to demonstrate that investment opportunities should not be limited to a privileged few. Instead, financial participation should be accessible to students preparing for their future, farmers seeking greater financial security, market traders building small businesses, and workers hoping to create long-term wealth for their families. This represents a significant shift in thinking. Rather than focusing exclusively on attracting foreign investors, the discussion increasingly centers on empowering domestic investors. The goal is to help citizens understand how financial markets work and how they can participate responsibly. For supporters of this approach, every citizen who learns to invest becomes more than a saver. That person becomes a contributor to national development. Small investments, when multiplied across thousands or even millions of people, can help finance businesses, infrastructure projects, and economic growth. In this sense, SIB 2026 is more than a financial exhibition. It is an effort to democratize investment and transform ordinary citizens into active participants in building Burkina Faso's economic future. One of the most important ideas behind Burkina Faso's emerging economic strategy is the belief that savings should not remain idle. Across Africa, millions of people save money every month. They put aside small amounts from salaries, business income, farming activities, or family support. Yet, much of this money never reaches the productive sectors of the economy. This creates a significant gap between personal savings and national development. Supporters of financial inclusion argue that when savings are transformed into investments, they become a powerful engine for growth. Instead of remaining inactive, these resources can help finance roads, energy projects, housing developments, schools, and businesses that create jobs. This philosophy is visible in Burkina Faso's recent efforts to mobilize resources from its citizens and its diaspora. One notable example is the Diaspora Bonds Initiative, which seeks to encourage Burkinabe living abroad to contribute directly to national development through structured investment programs. Rather than relying exclusively on external lenders, the country is exploring ways to channel the commitment and financial capacity of its own people. The significance of this approach extends beyond the amount of money raised. It represents a different vision of development. A worker living overseas is no longer viewed simply as someone sending money home to relatives. That individual can also become an investor in national infrastructure and economic transformation. Even relatively small investments can have meaningful collective impact when participation becomes widespread. Thousands of citizens contributing modest amounts may ultimately generate resources capable of supporting major development projects. For advocates of economic sovereignty, this is where the real power lies. National development becomes a shared responsibility rather than a process driven primarily by foreign capital. In that sense, every saver has the potential to become a nation builder, and every investment can become a contribution to the future of Burkina Faso. Many experts believe that financial education may be the most important element of any long-term strategy for economic sovereignty. A country can create investment opportunities, launch financial programs, and encourage citizen participation. However, if people do not understand how money works, these efforts will have limited impact. This challenge is not unique to Burkina Faso. Across many countries, people spend years studying mathematics, history, science, and literature without ever receiving practical education about savings, investing, risk management, or wealth creation. As adults, they are expected to make important financial decisions despite having little formal preparation. This is one reason why discussions at SIBA 2026 have extended beyond stock markets and investment products. There is growing interest in promoting financial literacy among younger generations and introducing financial education into schools and universities. The goal is not to turn every student into a stock trader. Instead, it is to help future citizens understand fundamental concepts that can improve their economic security. Learning how investments work, understanding the relationship between risk and return, and recognizing the importance of long-term planning can empower individuals throughout their lives. For young entrepreneurs, financial knowledge can improve business decisions. For workers, it can support retirement planning. For families, it can help build greater stability across generations. Supporters of this approach argue that economic development begins with informed citizens. Roads, factories, and infrastructure remain important, but human knowledge is equally valuable. A population that understands finance is better equipped to save, invest, and participate in national growth. In the long run, the most significant achievement may not be the number of people who purchase stocks or bonds. It may be the creation of a generation capable of making informed financial decisions and taking greater control of its economic future. As Burkina Faso advances its vision of economic sovereignty, not everyone is convinced that the path will be easy. Critics, particularly in parts of the Western media and policy community, have raised concerns about governance, political freedoms, and the long-term stability of the country's institutions. Some observers argue that strong economic ambitions must be accompanied by strong democratic institutions, transparent regulations, and reliable legal protections. From this perspective, attracting investment requires more than patriotic enthusiasm. It requires confidence that financial markets will operate fairly and that investors will have access to accurate information. These concerns deserve consideration. A successful financial market depends heavily on trust. Citizens will only invest their savings if they believe their money is protected and if they understand the risks involved. Transparency, accountability, and effective oversight are therefore essential components of any strategy designed to expand public participation in finance. At the same time, supporters of Burkina Faso's current direction argue that many international discussions focus heavily on political controversies while paying less attention to efforts aimed at increasing domestic economic participation. They point out that encouraging citizens to invest, promoting financial education, and mobilizing local savings are legitimate development goals that deserve serious examination. The debate, therefore, is not simply about politics, it is also about development strategy. Can a country strengthen economic sovereignty while improving transparency and investor confidence at the same time? This may be one of the most important questions facing Burkina Faso in the years ahead. If the country succeeds, it could demonstrate that domestic capital and citizen participation can play a larger role in national development. If it fails, critics will argue that ambitious rhetoric alone cannot replace the institutions required for long-term financial growth. The challenge is not choosing between sovereignty and transparency. The real challenge is ensuring that both advance together. The discussion taking place in Burkina Faso extends far beyond one country. Across Africa, governments continue to face a common challenge: development requires capital. Yet access to financing often depends heavily on external loans, foreign investment, and international institutions. This reality has led many policymakers to ask whether a greater share of development could be financed through domestic resources. In this context, Burkina Faso's efforts offer several lessons that may interest other African nations. The first lesson is the importance of mobilizing local savings. Every country possesses financial resources within its own population. While individual contributions may appear small, collective participation can create significant pools of capital capable of supporting national priorities. The second lesson involves financial education. Citizens cannot participate effectively in financial markets if they do not understand the basic principles of investing, risk management, and long-term wealth creation. Expanding financial literacy may therefore be just as important as creating new investment products. A third lesson concerns trust. No market can thrive without confidence. Governments seeking to attract domestic investors must demonstrate transparency, accountability, and responsible management of public resources. Citizens are far more likely to invest when they believe institutions are credible and reliable. Another important lesson is that economic sovereignty does not require isolation. Countries can strengthen domestic financial systems while remaining open to regional and international cooperation. The objective is not to reject outside capital, but to engage with it from a position of greater strength and confidence. For many supporters of Pan-African development, this represents an important evolution in thinking. Economic independence is no longer viewed solely through the lens of natural resources or political autonomy. It increasingly includes financial literacy, citizen participation, domestic investment, and the ability to mobilize capital from within society itself. Whether Burkina Faso ultimately succeeds or struggles, its experiment is already contributing to a larger conversation about how African nations can shape their own economic futures in the decades ahead. As CIBA 2026 comes to a close, the most important question is not whether the event was successful. The real question is whether the ideas discussed there can reshape the future of Burkina Faso. For years, IbrahimTraore has been associated with the struggle to defend national territory and restore security. Today, a new dimension is being added to that story. The conversation is expanding from military sovereignty to economic sovereignty. The objective is no longer limited to protecting borders. It now includes strengthening the country's ability to mobilize its own resources, educate its citizens, and finance its own development. CIBA 2026 symbolizes this broader ambition. It reflects an effort to bring financial markets closer to ordinary people and to challenge the belief that investing is reserved for a privileged minority. Farmers, students, traders, workers, and members of the diaspora are increasingly being invited into a conversation that was once dominated by specialists. Yet, success will depend on more than ambition. Economic sovereignty requires transparency, strong institutions, financial education, and public trust. Citizens must not only be encouraged to invest, they must also be equipped with the knowledge needed to make informed decisions and protect their financial future. The significance of this discussion extends beyond Burkina Faso. Across the continent, nations continue to search for ways to reduce dependency and strengthen their economic foundations. The ideas emerging from CIBA contribute to a larger debate about how Africa can finance its own development while remaining engaged with the wider world. Whether one supports or questions the approach, one fact is difficult to ignore. A new conversation is taking shape across Africa. It is a conversation about ownership, participation, and responsibility. As Pan-African aspirations continue to evolve, Burkina Faso has placed an important question before the continent. Can citizens become investors in their own future? For Captain IbrahimTraore, supporters of Pan-Africanism, advocates of the African Union, and those who believe in an Africa new, the answer may help define the next chapter of Africa's economic journey. What if one of Africa's poorest nations stopped waiting for foreign investors, international lenders, and multinational corporations to shape its future? What if ordinary citizens became the owners of the factories, farms, and industries that power their economy? That is exactly the experiment unfolding in Burkina Faso under Captain IbrahimTraore. While many African countries continue to rely heavily on foreign capital to finance development, Burkina Faso is attempting something far more ambitious. Through a program known as popular shareholding, hundreds of thousands of citizens are being invited to become direct stakeholders in national economic projects. For decades, Africa has faced a painful contradiction. The continent possesses enormous natural wealth, yet many countries remain dependent on exporting raw materials while importing finished products at higher prices. Burkina Faso has not escaped this reality. The country produces agricultural goods, livestock, and gold. Yet much of the value generated from those resources has historically left the country. Traore's response is built around a simple but powerful question. If Burkina Faso has resources, workers, farmers, and entrepreneurs, why should it always wait for outsiders to finance its development? This question challenges one of the most common assumptions about economic growth in Africa. Rather than asking who will invest in Burkina Faso, the government is asking how Burkinabe citizens can invest in themselves. The goal is not only to raise money, it is to transform the role of citizens within the economy. Instead of remaining consumers, taxpayers, and workers, they are encouraged to become shareholders and co-owners of national development projects. If you enjoy exploring bold economic ideas that could reshape Africa's future, make sure to subscribe and join us for more stories like this. Popular shareholding did not appear out of nowhere. Although many international observers describe it as a new economic experiment, its roots reach deep into African traditions and Burkina Faso's own history. For generations, communities across West Africa survived through collective effort. Families worked shared fields, cared for communal livestock, and contributed labor to projects that benefited everyone. Wealth was often understood not only as an individual achievement, but also as a collective responsibility. The success of one household strengthened the entire community. Supporters of popular shareholding argue that IbrahimTraore is adapting this traditional spirit to the modern economy. Instead of asking villagers to work together on a communal farm, the model encourages citizens to pool financial resources and become shareholders in enterprises that serve national development goals. The intellectual foundation of this idea is also linked to long-standing debates about African economic independence. Thinkers such as Laurent Gbagbo promoted the concept of community entrepreneurship as a way to mobilize local resources rather than relying exclusively on external funding. Their argument was simple. A nation that cannot finance its own productive sectors will struggle to control its own future. Many observers also see echoes of the philosophy associated with Thomas Sankara. During the 1980s, Sankara emphasized self-reliance, local production, and dignity through work. While the economic tools are different today, the underlying message remains familiar. Development should begin with the people themselves. What makes Traore's approach unique is the attempt to transform a cultural value into a modern financial mechanism. Citizens are not simply encouraged to support development in theory. They are invited to participate directly through ownership. This distinction matters. A factory funded by community shareholders is viewed differently from one financed entirely by foreign investors. For supporters, it creates a stronger connection between economic growth and national responsibility. The project becomes more than a business venture. It becomes a symbol of collective ambition and shared destiny. At first glance, many people compare IbrahimTraore's economic vision to the model that helped transform Norway into one of the wealthiest nations in the world. Both approaches begin with a similar principle. National resources should benefit the population rather than a small elite or foreign interests. Norway used revenues from its oil and gas sector to build a massive national wealth fund. The state collected and managed those resources on behalf of the population, creating long-term financial security for future generations. It is often presented as one of the most successful examples of resource management in modern history. Burkina Faso shares the same desire for economic sovereignty, but Traore is attempting something fundamentally different. Instead of relying primarily on the state to manage wealth for citizens, he is encouraging citizens to become direct participants in the creation of that wealth. This distinction may seem subtle, but it changes the entire relationship between people and the economy. In the traditional model, citizens benefit indirectly through public services, infrastructure, and government spending. In the Burkinabe model, citizens are invited to become shareholders in projects that seek to generate economic value. Supporters argue that this approach goes beyond ownership on paper. It creates a sense of responsibility and engagement. When people own a stake in a factory, an agricultural project, or a mining enterprise, they may feel a stronger interest in its success. Traore's innovation lies in combining modern investment mechanisms with a community-centered culture. Rather than copying a European model, he has adapted the principle of shared prosperity to local realities. The goal is not merely to distribute wealth after it is created. The goal is to involve citizens in creating that wealth from the beginning. For this reason, many observers believe Burkina Faso is not building a version of Norway. It is attempting to create something uniquely African, shaped by its own history, traditions, and development challenges. Turning an idea into reality required more than speeches and patriotic slogans. To make popular shareholding work, Burkina Faso needed an institution capable of organizing investments, managing subscriptions, and connecting citizens to national development projects. That institution became the Agency for the Promotion of Community Entrepreneurship, widely known as APEC. Created in 2023, APEC was designed to provide the legal and operational framework for community-owned enterprises. Its mission is straightforward but ambitious. It seeks to mobilize domestic savings, identify productive projects, and channel citizen investments into sectors considered essential for national development. One of the most remarkable aspects of the program is its accessibility. Participation is not reserved for wealthy investors or large corporations. Farmers, workers, retirees, small business owners, students, and members of the diaspora can all become shareholders. This broad participation is central to the philosophy behind the initiative. Economic transformation should involve the population as a whole, rather than a limited group of elites. The response has been significant. Hundreds of thousands of Burkinabe citizens have joined the program, while billions of CFA francs have been mobilized to support community enterprises. These figures suggest that many people are willing to contribute financially when they believe they have a direct stake in the outcome. The participation of the diaspora has also played an important role. Burkinabe citizens living abroad are encouraged to invest in projects from their countries of residence, allowing them to contribute to development without returning home permanently. For supporters, the success of APEC is measured by more than the money collected. It represents a shift in mentality. Citizens are no longer viewed simply as beneficiaries of development programs. They are becoming partners in the process. Whether this model ultimately succeeds or fails, it has already changed the conversation about who should finance the future of Burkina Faso. The true test of any economic vision is not the number of speeches delivered or the amount of money collected. The real test is whether tangible results appear on the ground. In Burkina Faso, supporters of popular shareholding point to a growing list of projects that aim to prove the model can move from theory to reality. One of the most visible examples is the development of tomato processing facilities. For years, Burkina Faso produced large quantities of tomatoes, yet the country still depended heavily on imported tomato products. This situation reflected a broader challenge faced by many African economies. Raw materials were produced locally, but much of the value-added processing occurred elsewhere. The new factories seek to change that equation. Instead of exporting agricultural products in their raw form, Burkina Faso aims to process more of them domestically. Supporters believe this approach can create jobs, strengthen local industries, and reduce dependence on imported goods. Agriculture is not the only target. The broader program also includes agricultural mechanization initiatives, centralized purchasing systems for agricultural products, and semi-mechanized mining projects. Each project is designed around the same principle. Resources generated within the country should contribute more directly to national prosperity. The expected benefits extend beyond production figures. New industries can create employment opportunities for young people, provide more stable markets for farmers, and encourage additional investment in local supply chains. Instead of exporting value, the country seeks to retain more of it within its borders. For many citizens, these projects represent something larger than economic development. They symbolize the possibility of transforming Burkina Faso from a supplier of raw materials into a producer of finished goods. Whether that transformation succeeds remains to be seen. But the ambition behind it is undeniable. It is an attempt to build industrial growth with the participation of the people themselves. Not everyone is convinced that popular shareholding will deliver the results its supporters expect. As the program gains attention, it has also attracted criticism from international observers, economists, and commentators who question whether such an ambitious experiment can succeed over the long term. One concern involves governance. Critics argue that collecting money from hundreds of thousands of citizens is only the beginning. The greater challenge is ensuring that projects are managed efficiently, transparently, and profitably. Without strong oversight, public trust could be damaged. Others point to financial risk. Any investment carries uncertainty, and not every factory, agricultural enterprise, or mining project will automatically become successful. Some observers worry that ordinary citizens could face disappointment if certain projects fail to meet expectations. Supporters of the initiative respond that risk exists in every development strategy. They argue that dependence on foreign loans, external aid, and imported products also carries significant risks. From this perspective, popular shareholding is not risk-free, but neither is the status quo. Another criticism is that community-owned enterprises may struggle to compete against large international corporations. Yet supporters note that many successful industrial nations protected and supported domestic industries during their early stages of development. Ultimately, the debate reflects two different visions of economic progress. One emphasizes integration into existing global financial structures. The other seeks to build stronger domestic ownership and control over productive sectors. Whether popular shareholding becomes a historic success or an important lesson remains uncertain. What is clear is that Burkina Faso has opened a conversation that extends far beyond its borders. The question is no longer whether Africans can participate in development. The question is whether they can become owners of it. Whether popular shareholding ultimately succeeds or fails will only be known years from now. Economic transformation is never measured in months. It is measured in generations. Yet even at this early stage, the experiment taking place in Burkina Faso has already captured attention across Africa because it challenges assumptions that many people considered unquestionable for decades. Development discussions often focused on attracting foreign investment, securing international loans, and obtaining external assistance. Ibrahim Traore has not rejected cooperation with the outside world, but he has placed a different question at the center of the conversation. What happens when citizens themselves become investors in national development? That question may prove to be the most important aspect of this entire project. Factories can be built, programs can change, governments can come and go, but a population that begins to see itself as an owner rather than a spectator may develop a completely different relationship with the economy. The broader lesson for Africa is not that every country should copy Burkina Faso's model exactly. Each nation has its own history, institutions, and challenges. The lesson is that development becomes more powerful when people feel personally connected to it. Citizens are more likely to support economic transformation when they believe they share both the responsibility and the rewards. Captain IbrahimTraore is attempting to turn that idea into reality by linking ownership, participation, and industrial development. He is testing a model that many countries have discussed, but few have attempted on such a scale. History will determine whether this vision fulfills its promise. Yet, one fact is already clear. Burkina Faso has launched one of the most closely watched economic experiments in modern Africa. For supporters of Pan-African development, Africa New Thinking, Burkina Faso, Captain IbrahimTraore, the African Union, Pan-Africanism, and Ibrahim Traore's vision of economic sovereignty. The outcome could influence debates across the continent for years to come. If you enjoyed this analysis, subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts below. Your perspective may be part of the conversation shaping Africa's future. What if 3 nations in the Sahel were preparing to challenge one of the most controversial monetary systems in modern African history? For nearly 80 years, the CFA franc has been part of the economic reality of several West African countries. Supporters describe it as a source of stability that helped control inflation and reduce monetary uncertainty. Critics, however, see it as a reminder of an era when African nations had limited control over their own economic destiny. Today, that debate is becoming more intense. Under the leadership of Captain IbrahimTraore in Burkina Faso, and alongside the governments of Mali and Niger within the alliance of Sahel states, discussions about monetary sovereignty are moving closer to the center of regional politics. What began as a conversation about currency is increasingly becoming a broader discussion about independence, economic power, and the future of Africa. If the plans being discussed within the alliance of Sahel states continue to advance, the consequences could reach far beyond the borders of the 3 countries. They could influence how many Africans think about development, sovereignty, and self-determination in the decades ahead. Before we continue, follow this channel for more analysis of the major political and economic changes shaping Africa today. To understand why this issue matters, we must first understand the history of the CFA franc. The CFA franc was created in 1945 and has remained one of the most enduring monetary systems in Africa. Throughout the years, it provided exchange rate stability and helped limit inflation in member countries. These advantages are often cited by those who support the system. Yet criticism never disappeared. For many Pan-African thinkers, the question has never been only about financial stability. The deeper issue is sovereignty. Can a nation fully control its future if it does not completely control its monetary policy? As a result, the CFA franc gradually became more than a currency. For some, it represents stability and predictability. For others, it symbolizes unfinished economic independence. That is why the current debate surrounding the future of the CFA franc has captured attention across Africa and beyond. When Ibrahim Traore speaks about sovereignty, he rarely limits the conversation to politics alone. In his view, security, natural resources, economic development, and national independence are deeply connected. That perspective helps explain why the debate over the CFA franc has gained new momentum under his leadership. Traore emerged during a period of profound uncertainty in the Sahel. Burkina Faso, like its neighbors Mali and Niger, faced serious security challenges, economic pressures, and growing public frustration with traditional political arrangements. In that environment, many citizens began asking difficult questions about how much control their countries truly had over their own future. For Traore and many of his supporters, economic sovereignty became one of the most important parts of the answer. The argument is straightforward. A nation may possess vast natural resources, yet still struggle to transform those resources into broad prosperity if key economic decisions remain constrained by external structures. As a result, discussions about currency have become part of a much larger conversation about self-determination. This message has resonated far beyond Burkina Faso. Across Africa, many young people see Traore as a symbol of a generation willing to challenge long-standing assumptions. His popularity is not based solely on economic policy. It is driven by the belief that African nations should have greater control over their resources, institutions, and development strategies. At the same time, it is important to separate symbolism from reality. The future of monetary sovereignty will not be decided by speeches alone. It will depend on practical achievements, effective governance, and the ability to create institutions capable of supporting long-term economic stability. That is why the current debate matters so much. The question is not simply whether the CFA franc should continue. The deeper question is whether Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger can build a model that gives them greater economic freedom while maintaining stability and public confidence. For supporters of reform, this is a historic opportunity. For skeptics, it is a major risk. Either way, Ibrahim Traore has succeeded in bringing the issue of monetary sovereignty to the center of Africa's political conversation. While much of the public discussion focuses on the possibility of a future currency, the Alliance of Sahel states is pursuing a much broader project behind the scenes. The real story may not be about replacing the CFA franc tomorrow. It may be about building the institutions that could make monetary sovereignty possible in the future. The Alliance of Sahel States, often referred to as AES, brings together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. Although the alliance first gained international attention because of security cooperation, its ambitions now extend far beyond military matters. The three governments increasingly speak about economic integration, regional development, and greater strategic independence. This is where the discussion becomes particularly important. History shows that successful monetary systems are rarely created overnight. Before a country or a group of countries can introduce a new currency, they must first establish the foundations that support it. Without those foundations, even the most ambitious monetary project can face serious difficulties. For that reason, AES has been exploring ways to strengthen cooperation in several key areas. These include infrastructure development, regional trade, investment coordination, and financial cooperation. The objective is not simply to create new institutions. The objective is to reduce vulnerabilities and increase the ability of member states to make independent economic decisions. One of the most significant developments has been the effort to create financial mechanisms that operate within the alliance itself. Supporters view these initiatives as early building blocks of a more self-reliant regional economy. From this perspective, the debate over monetary sovereignty is only one piece of a much larger strategy. The alliance appears to be asking a broader question. Can the countries of the Sahel create an economic framework that serves their own priorities rather than relying primarily on systems designed elsewhere? The answer remains uncertain. However, what is already clear is that AES is attempting to move beyond rhetoric and toward institution building. The institution-building efforts of AES became even more visible when discussions emerged about creating financial structures capable of supporting long-term regional development. Among the most notable initiatives is the proposed development bank designed to help finance infrastructure, industry, energy projects, and strategic investments across Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. For supporters of the alliance, this step is extremely important. A currency can only succeed if it is backed by productive economic activity. Roads, power generation, agricultural modernization, mining development, and industrial expansion all contribute to the strength of an economy. Without these foundations, monetary independence becomes difficult to sustain. This explains why many observers believe the development bank may be more important than any future currency announcement. It represents an attempt to create financial tools that serve regional priorities and reduce dependence on external sources of funding. Supporters argue that such institutions could help channel resources toward projects that directly benefit local populations. They also believe stronger economic coordination could increase trade among member states and encourage long-term investment within the region. However, significant challenges remain. Building effective institutions requires transparency, professional management, financial discipline, and public confidence. Even the strongest political vision can struggle if these elements are missing. This is why the future of AES cannot be measured by declarations alone. The true test will be whether these new institutions deliver measurable improvements in the daily lives of citizens. Can they support businesses? Can they create jobs? Can they finance infrastructure that stimulates economic growth? These questions matter because they determine whether monetary sovereignty becomes a practical reality or remains an attractive political aspiration. For now, the alliance appears committed to laying the groundwork. Rather than rushing toward a new currency, it is gradually building the structures that could one day support greater financial independence. If those efforts succeed, historians may look back on this period as the beginning of a major economic transformation in the Sahel. If AES eventually moves beyond preparation and begins replacing the CFA franc, the consequences could be significant. Supporters believe such a transition would provide member states with greater control over monetary policy, allowing governments to align financial decisions more closely with national development priorities. In theory, greater monetary independence could create opportunities to support domestic industries, strengthen agricultural production, expand infrastructure investment, and respond more flexibly to economic challenges. Countries would no longer be limited by a monetary framework that many critics believe was designed for a different historical context. Yet monetary sovereignty is not automatically a path to prosperity. History offers many examples of countries that gained control over their currencies but struggled to maintain stability. Without strong institutions, disciplined fiscal policies, and public confidence, a new monetary system can face serious difficulties. Inflation may rise, currency values may fluctuate, investors may become cautious, the cost of imports can increase, placing pressure on households and businesses. This is why many economists argue that the success of any future AES currency would depend less on symbolism and more on governance. The real challenge would be maintaining trust. Citizens, businesses, and international partners would need confidence that the new system could preserve value and support long-term growth. There are also lessons from other regions of the world. Successful monetary unions are usually built on years of economic coordination, shared rules, and institutional development. They require more than political will. They require economic discipline and sustained cooperation. As a result, the debate should not be framed as a choice between independence and stability. The true objective is achieving both. If AES can combine greater sovereignty with sound economic management, it could create a model that attracts attention across Africa. If it cannot, the transition could become far more difficult than many supporters expect. One reason the AES project attracts so much international attention is that it challenges long-standing assumptions about economic integration in West Africa. While supporters view the alliance as a bold experiment in sovereignty, many critics, particularly in Western policy circles, remain skeptical. Their concerns generally fall into several categories. First, there is the fear of financial instability. Critics argue that moving away from an established monetary system could create uncertainty for investors, increase inflation risks, and place pressure on already fragile economies. From this perspective, stability should remain the highest priority. Second, some analysts question whether Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger currently possess the economic foundations necessary to support greater monetary independence. They point to security challenges, infrastructure gaps, and fiscal constraints as potential obstacles. Supporters of AES respond with a different argument. They acknowledge the risks, but insist that long-term development requires the ability to make independent economic choices. In their view, stability alone is not enough if it fails to generate broad prosperity and meaningful economic transformation. The larger question may therefore be, who gets to define success? Should African nations continue relying on existing structures, or should they experiment with new models that reflect their own priorities and circumstances? The answer remains uncertain, but the debate itself is already reshaping political discussions across the continent. Looking ahead, three possible futures emerge. AES could successfully build the institutions needed for greater monetary sovereignty. It could achieve only partial reforms while still influencing regional policy, or it could struggle under economic and political pressures. Regardless of which scenario unfolds, one fact is clear. The conversation is no longer only about the CFA franc. It is about sovereignty, development, and Africa's right to determine its own economic future. That is why governments, investors, and ordinary citizens across the continent are paying close attention to what happens next. The future of the CFA franc remains uncertain. No official AES currency is circulating today, and many of the most important decisions still lie ahead. Yet something significant has already changed. The discussion is no longer limited to economists, central bankers, or government officials. It has become part of a wider African conversation about sovereignty, development, and self-determination. For supporters of reform, the issue is simple. A nation should have the ability to shape its own economic destiny. For critics, the challenge is equally clear. Political ambition must be matched by strong institutions, sound policies, and economic discipline. Without those foundations, even the most inspiring vision can face serious obstacles. This is why the story of AES matters far beyond Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. The alliance is testing an idea that resonates across the continent: Can African nations create financial systems that reflect their own priorities while maintaining stability and attracting investment? The answer could influence future debates from West Africa to other parts of the continent. Perhaps the most important lesson is that true independence is not achieved through declarations alone. It requires institutions, infrastructure, productive economies, and public trust. Monetary sovereignty is not the destination. It is only one step in a much larger journey. Whether AES ultimately succeeds or struggles, the questions raised by Captain IbrahimTraore are unlikely to disappear. They touch issues that many Africans continue to debate: control of resources, economic freedom, and the right to determine national priorities. As the conversation continues, the eyes of Africa will remain fixed on the Sahel, the decisions made in Burkina Faso, the vision promoted by Ibrahim Traore, the aspirations of Pan-Africanism, and the future role of the African Union may all become part of a larger Africa news story. For many supporters of the Pan-African movement, this moment represents more than policy. It represents possibilities. If you want to continue exploring the forces reshaping Africa, follow this channel and join us in examining the developments that will define the continent's future. For more than 60 years, Burkina Faso watched its wealth leave the country in its most basic form. Gold was dug from the ground but refined elsewhere. Cotton was harvested from the fields but turned into fabric in foreign factories. Farmers worked under the hot Sahel sun, yet much of the value created from their labor ended up thousands of miles away. Now imagine something different. Imagine a market of 1.4 billion consumers suddenly opening its doors to Burkina Faso. Imagine those doors opening without tariffs, without many of the barriers that have traditionally limited African exports. For many observers, that announcement from China was the headline. But the real story may not be happening in Beijing at all. The real story may be unfolding in Ouagadougou. Because while China was opening a market, Ibrahim Traore was preparing something else. He was preparing Burkina Faso to enter that market differently than before. Before we explore that possibility, it is important to understand what Burkina Faso has been trying to escape for decades. The country followed a familiar pattern seen across much of Africa. Raw materials left. Wealth left with them. Cotton was exported as cotton. Gold was exported as gold. Agricultural products were exported with little processing. The countries that bought those resources often earned far more by refining, manufacturing, packaging, and selling finished products than Burkina Faso earned from producing the resources themselves. That reality created a painful contradiction. Burkina Faso was rich in resources but struggled to translate those resources into widespread prosperity. The problem was never the absence of wealth beneath the soil. The problem was the inability to capture enough value before that wealth crossed the border. Today, that may finally be starting to change. China's decision to grant zero-tariff access to African exports is being described by many economists as one of the most significant trade openings in modern African history. For Burkina Faso, the announcement was especially important because it offered something that previous generations rarely had: direct access to one of the largest consumer markets on Earth. A market of 1.4 billion people changes the conversation. For years, African nations were often told that development depended on aid packages, loans, or foreign assistance programs. China presented something different. Instead of offering a donation, it offered market access. Instead of promising support in the future, it reduced barriers that had previously made trade more difficult. That distinction matters. Aid can help solve temporary problems. Access to customers can create long-term economic growth. Under the new arrangement, Products from Burkina Faso can enter China with significant advantages compared to many previous trade conditions. For farmers, exporters, chiminiches, and manufacturers, that creates opportunities that simply did not exist before. But it is important to understand what this policy does and does not do. Zero tariffs do not automatically make a country rich. They do not build factories. They do not train workers. They do not create industrial capacity. What they do is open a door. And history shows that open doors only benefit nations that are prepared to walk through them. This is why the story becomes much more interesting when we shift our attention from Beijing to Burkina Faso itself. China has provided access to the market. The question is what Burkina Faso intends to sell inside that market. If the country continues exporting mostly raw materials, the gains may be limited. Raw cotton, raw gold, and unprocessed agricultural products generate far less value than finished goods. But if Burkina Faso can export refined gold, textiles, processed foods, and manufactured products, then the impact of zero tariffs becomes far more powerful. The opportunity is real. The challenge is real as well. And that challenge is exactly where IbrahimTraore enters the story. IbrahimTraore appears to understand a reality that many resource-rich countries have struggled to overcome. Having valuable resources is not enough. The real question is, who captures the value created from those resources? For decades, Burkina Faso exported gold and cotton while most of the higher-value activities happened elsewhere. Refining, manufacturing, branding, packaging, and large-scale distribution were often controlled outside the country. As a result, Burkina Faso participated in global trade, but remained near the bottom of the value chain. Traore has repeatedly argued that this model cannot continue if the country hopes to achieve genuine economic sovereignty. His approach is built around a simple idea. Burkina Faso should not only extract resources, it should process them. One of the clearest examples is gold. Instead of sending large amounts of gold abroad for refining, the government has supported the creation of a national gold refinery. The goal is not merely symbolic. Refining gold inside Burkina Faso allows more economic activity to remain within the country. It creates jobs, develops technical expertise, improves oversight, and potentially increases government revenue. The same thinking is visible in the mining sector more broadly. Through state participation and greater control over strategic resources, the government is attempting to ensure that national wealth contributes more directly to national development. But perhaps the most important aspect of Traore's vision is not a specific project. It is a change in mindset. For generations, many African economies were encouraged to focus on extraction, produce raw materials, export them, import finished goods. Traore is challenging that formula. He is asking a different question. What happens when the country that grows the cotton also produces the fabric? What happens when the country that mines the gold also refines the gold? What happens when economic value stays closer to the people who create it? Those questions are becoming increasingly important because China has now opened a market that may reward countries capable of producing more than raw materials. And that is exactly why the next stage of Burkina Faso's strategy may prove even more important than the first. If gold represents Burkina Faso's mineral wealth, cotton represents its opportunity to build a modern industrial economy. For decades, Burkina Faso has been one of West Africa's major cotton producers. Every year, farmers grow and harvest cotton across the country. Yet the biggest profits have rarely stayed in Burkina Faso. The reason is simple. Cotton was often exported as a raw material. Once it left the country, the next stages of production happened elsewhere. Foreign factories turned cotton into yarn. Yarn became fabric. Fabric became clothing. Each step added value, created jobs, and generated profits outside Burkina Faso. This is the cycle that Ibrahim Traore wants to change. One of the most important symbols of that effort is the IRO Burkina textile project. The goal is not simply to build another factory. The goal is to create a larger industrial chain inside Burkina Faso. The vision follows a clear path. Cotton becomes yarn. Yarn becomes fabric. Fabric becomes finished products. Every stage creates additional value. Every stage creates more employment opportunities. Every stage allows more money to remain inside the national economy. This is how many successful manufacturing nations developed. They did not become wealthy simply because they possessed natural resources. They became wealthy because they learned how to process those resources themselves. The difference can be enormous. A single bale of cotton provides income mainly for the farmer who produces it. A textile industry supports farmers, factory workers, transport companies, technicians, managers, and exporters at the same time. That is why industrialization matters so much to Burkina Faso's future. And if China's tariff-free market remains open, Burkina Faso may eventually export textiles and finished products instead of raw cotton alone. If that happens, the country will not simply be selling resources. It will be selling value, jobs, and economic strength created at home. History is full of nations that missed great opportunities because they were not prepared when those opportunities arrived. Burkina Faso is attempting something different. At almost the exact moment China opened its market to African exports, Burkina Faso began taking steps to increase domestic processing, strengthen industrial capacity, and gain greater control over its resources. Whether by design or coincidence, these two developments are now intersecting in a way that could reshape the country's economic future. Think about the situation from a strategic perspective. China has created access to one of the largest consumer markets in the world. That opportunity alone is significant. But market access only becomes transformative when producers have something valuable to sell. This is where Traore's economic vision becomes important. The National Gold Refinery, textile projects, and efforts to expand local processing are all attempts to ensure that Burkina Faso enters global markets with higher value products rather than raw materials alone. In many ways, this is a story about preparation meeting opportunity. For decades, Burkina Faso had resources but lacked sufficient industrial capacity. Now, industrial capacity is beginning to emerge just as a major export market becomes more accessible. That combination does not guarantee success. There are still major challenges ahead. Factories must become productive. Workers must be trained. Infrastructure must improve. Investment must continue. But opportunities of this scale do not appear every generation. That is why many supporters of Traore believe the current moment may represent a historic turning point. Not because China is offering special favors, not because prosperity is guaranteed, but because Burkina Faso may finally have a chance to move from exporting what it has to exporting what it creates. China opened the door. Traore is trying to build the road that leads to it. And for the first time in many decades, those two developments are happening at the same time. Not everyone is convinced that Burkina Faso is moving in the right direction. Critics in Western policy circles often argue that the country may simply be replacing one dependency with another. According to this view, moving away from France while building closer economic ties with China does not automatically create economic sovereignty. It merely changes the identity of the external partner. Others argue that China is primarily interested in access to African resources and new markets for Chinese products. They point to trade imbalances and warn that African countries could remain suppliers of raw materials if they fail to industrialize. These concerns deserve serious consideration. However, there is another side to the debate. Every major power pursues its own interests. France did. Britain did. The United States does. China does as well. The real question is not whether China benefits. The real question is whether Burkina Faso benefits at the same time. That answer will depend on what happens inside Burkina Faso over the next several years. If the country continues exporting mainly raw gold, raw cotton, and unprocessed agricultural products, many critics may be proven correct. But if Burkina Faso succeeds in refining its gold, expanding textile production, and developing local processing industries, the outcome could look very different. In that scenario, China would not simply become a buyer of resources, it would become a customer for products carrying more value created inside Burkina Faso itself. Ultimately, the debate is not about China versus the West. It is about whether Burkina Faso can finally move higher in the global value chain and capture more of the wealth generated by its own resources. The story of Burkina Faso is not really about tariffs. It is not even primarily about China. It is about what a nation chooses to do when a rare opportunity appears. For more than 60 years, Burkina Faso exported raw materials while much of the value created from those materials was captured elsewhere. Gold left the country. Cotton left the country. Agricultural products left the country. The resources were Burkinabe, but the greatest rewards often were not. Today, the situation may be changing. China has opened a market of 1.4 billion consumers. For the first time, Burkina Faso has access to an enormous commercial opportunity with fewer barriers than ever before. But history teaches us that open markets alone do not create prosperity. Factories create prosperity. Skills create prosperity. Industrial capacity creates prosperity. That is why the actions of IbrahimTraore matter so much in this moment. While many people focus on the open door in China, Traore has been focused on preparing what Burkina Faso will carry through that door. Gold refining, textile production, agricultural processing. These are not simply economic projects. They are attempts to keep more value inside the country and build a stronger foundation for future generations. The outcome is still uncertain. The challenges remain enormous. But for the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is trying to move beyond the role of a supplier of cheap raw materials and toward the role of a producer of higher value goods. Whether that vision succeeds or fails will shape the future of the country for years to come. And perhaps that is the lesson for Africa New, for the Pan-African movement, for the African Union, and for every nation seeking greater economic sovereignty. The goal is not simply to own resources. The goal is to transform those resources into lasting prosperity. That is the vision many supporters see in Captain IbrahimTraore, in Burkina Faso, in Pan-Africanism, and in the broader hopes surrounding IbrahimTraore's economic agenda. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and join us as we continue exploring the stories shaping the future of Africa. For decades, Burkina Faso watched billions of dollars in gold leave its soil, while much of the country remained trapped in poverty. Foreign mining corporations controlled the richest gold fields, exported enormous profits overseas, and left behind a nation still struggling with weak infrastructure, unemployment, and insecurity. It was one of Africa's most painful contradictions, a country rich in natural wealth, yet unable to fully benefit from it. Now, that system is being challenged by one man who has become one of the most controversial and talked about leaders in Africa today. Captain IbrahimTraore is attempting something many previous governments never seriously tried. He wants Burkina Faso's gold to serve Burkina Faso first. Under Traore's military administration, the government has expanded state ownership in strategic mines, tightened mining laws, increased local control, and pushed foreign companies out of positions they dominated for decades. Supporters call it an economic revolution. Critics call it dangerous resource nationalism. But whether the world likes it or not, Burkina Faso is rewriting the rules of who controls African wealth. At the same time, the country remains locked in a brutal conflict against armed extremist groups across the Sahel. For Traore, gold is no longer just an export commodity. It has become a weapon of economic survival and national sovereignty. And what is happening in Burkina Faso may not stay in Burkina Faso. Across Africa, more governments are beginning to ask the same question. Who should truly benefit from Africa's resources? If you want to understand where Africa's future may be heading next, this is a story you cannot afford to ignore. Before Ibrahim Traore came to power, Burkina Faso's gold industry was dominated by foreign corporations for decades. International mining companies from Canada, Australia, and Europe controlled some of the country's most productive gold mines, while billions of dollars in profits flowed out of the nation every year. Meanwhile, many communities living near the mines still struggled with poverty, poor roads, weak healthcare systems, and limited economic opportunity. To many people inside Burkina Faso, it created a painful reality. The country was rich underground, but poor above it. Gold eventually became Burkina Faso's largest export. Yet, despite producing huge amounts of gold, the average citizen saw very little change in daily life. Foreign firms often handled the extraction, transportation, refining, and export process, while local participation remained limited. In many cases, Burkina Faso received taxes and royalties, but the larger share of long-term profits stayed in foreign hands. This model was defended by international investors, who argued they provided technology, expertise, security, and financing that Burkina Faso could not easily provide on its own. But critics inside Africa increasingly viewed the system differently. Many believed it resembled a modern version of economic dependency, where African nations supplied raw materials while outside powers captured most of the wealth. That frustration slowly grew across the Sahel. In Burkina Faso, people began asking difficult questions. How could a country produce so much gold while millions still lacked electricity and jobs? Why were foreign corporations becoming wealthier while local communities remained underdeveloped? By the time Ibrahim Traore emerged as the country's new military leader, anger toward the old mining system had already become deeply rooted. He did not create the frustration. He inherited it. But unlike previous governments, Traore decided to turn that frustration into political action. For many of his supporters, the battle over gold was no longer only about economics. It was about dignity, sovereignty, and who truly owned Burkina Faso's future. When Ibrahim Traore seized power in 2022, many outside observers focused on the military dimension of his leadership. But inside Burkina Faso, another transformation was beginning to take shape. Traore was preparing to try to challenge the economic structure that had controlled the country's gold industry for decades. His government moved quickly to increase state authority over strategic mining assets. New mining reforms expanded government participation in major gold projects, while local investors gained larger ownership stakes in industrial mines. Reports indicated that 6 of Burkina Faso's 15 active industrial gold mines had shifted into majority Burkinab ownership. 3 of them reportedly came under direct state control. That change was historic. Before Traore's administration, Only one industrial gold mine in the country had been controlled by a local company. In just a few years, the balance of power inside Burkina Faso's mining sector began to shift dramatically away from foreign corporations. Traore framed the issue in simple but powerful language. Burkina Faso's gold, he argued, should first benefit Burkina Faso's people. That message resonated deeply across a population exhausted by insecurity, poverty, and decades of economic frustration. Supporters viewed the reforms as the beginning of a new era of economic sovereignty. To them, Traore was not simply changing mining contracts. He was attempting to dismantle an entire system that allowed African resources to enrich outside powers, while local populations remained dependent and vulnerable. The government also tightened mining regulations, increased state participation requirements, and pushed for greater local involvement in production and logistics. Foreign companies began facing stricter oversight and growing political pressure. Critics warned that these moves could scare away investment and weaken confidence in Burkina Faso's economy. But Traore's supporters responded with a different question. If the previous system was truly working, why did one of Africa's most resource-rich nations remain trapped in crisis? For many Burkinabe citizens, the gold industry was no longer just about business. It had become a symbol of national control, pride, and independence. Traore's strategy was never only about taking control of gold mines. The larger goal was to keep more of the gold profits inside Burkina Faso instead of allowing billions of dollars to leave the country every year. To support that vision, the government reportedly began building a state-backed investment structure known as Sinaiji, a name that translates roughly to preparing for tomorrow. The idea behind the project was straightforward but ambitious. When global gold prices rise, the state would save and reinvest part of the profits rather than immediately spending everything on short-term needs. According to government officials, the money could be directed into roads, electricity systems, industrial facilities, and national infrastructure projects. Burkina Faso also hopes to strengthen local manufacturing capacity and reduce dependence on imported goods over time. For decades, many African countries exported raw materials while importing finished products from abroad. Gold left Africa. Wealth often followed, but industrial capacity remained weak. Traore's supporters argue that Burkina Faso must break that cycle if it wants real economic independence. The government's mining reforms are therefore connected to a much larger economic vision. Gold is being treated not only as a source of export revenue, but also as the foundation for national reconstruction. Officials believe that if resource profits remain inside the country, Burkina Faso could gradually build stronger institutions, stronger industries, and eventually a stronger middle class. At the same time, rising global gold prices have made this strategy even more important. Every increase in the value of gold potentially means more money for infrastructure, public investment, and state development. Supporters describe this as one of the boldest economic experiments in modern Sahel history. Critics remain skeptical and question whether the government can manage such large financial resources effectively, but for many ordinary citizens, the central message is simple. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso is attempting to use its gold wealth to build Burkina Faso itself. While Burkina Faso was restructuring its gold industry, the country was also fighting one of the most dangerous security crises in Africa. Armed extremist groups linked to regional insurgencies continued attacking villages, military positions, and transportation routes across the Sahel. Entire communities were displaced, thousands of civilians were killed, and large parts of the country remained unstable. For Ibrahim Traore's government, this changed the meaning of gold completely. Gold was no longer just a valuable export. It became a financial lifeline for national survival. The government needed money to pay soldiers, secure mining regions, purchase military equipment, and maintain state operations during a prolonged conflict. In this environment, every ounce of gold carried strategic importance. Control over mining revenue meant control over the country's ability to defend itself. At the same time, Burkina Faso dramatically increased gold production. Reports suggested the country produced a record 94 tons of gold in 2025, a major rise from previous years. Government officials credited tighter state oversight, stronger mining reforms, and more aggressive crackdowns on gold smuggling networks. For years, large quantities of gold reportedly disappeared through illegal trade routes crossing neighboring borders. That meant lost tax revenue and billions of dollars escaping state control. Under Traore's administration, security forces increased efforts to monitor transportation routes and reduce illegal exports. Supporters argue that these measures are helping Burkina Faso recover wealth that previously vanished outside official systems. Critics warn that conflict and instability still threaten long-term mining operations. Both sides agree on one reality. Gold now sits at the center of Burkina Faso's future. This is why Traore often presents the mining sector as part of a larger national struggle. In his view, economic sovereignty and military survival cannot be separated. Without control over resources, Burkina Faso may never have the financial strength needed to stabilize the country and rebuild after years of violence. As Burkina Faso pushed deeper into resource nationalism, reactions from Western governments, international investors, and foreign mining corporations became increasingly tense. For decades, global mining companies operated across Africa under systems that gave them major influence over extraction, exports, and long-term profits. Now, leaders like Ibrahim Traore are challenging that structure directly. Foreign investors worry that Burkina Faso's policies could create uncertainty throughout Africa's mining sector. Nationalization fears, changing regulations, and stronger state intervention make international companies nervous about long-term investments worth billions of dollars. Some firms fear that if Burkina Faso's strategy succeeds, other African governments may attempt similar reforms. That possibility could reshape the balance of power across global mining markets. Critics also argue that Burkina Faso may lack the technical expertise, infrastructure, and financial transparency required to manage large mining operations efficiently without heavy foreign involvement. Others warn that political instability and ongoing conflict could scare away international capital at a time when the country still needs outside investment. But supporters of Traore answer those criticisms with a different argument. They ask why Burkina Faso remained poor after decades of foreign-dominated mining. If the old system was truly fair and effective, why did many mining communities still lack roads, electricity, clean water, and economic opportunity? To Traore's supporters, this is not simply a debate about business climate. It is a debate about sovereignty itself. They believe African nations should no longer export enormous wealth while remaining dependent on foreign powers economically. Still, the reality is more complicated than simple slogans. Burkina Faso cannot fully isolate itself from the global economy. The country still needs technology, equipment, financing, and international trade relationships. The challenge now is finding a balance between attracting investment and protecting national control over strategic resources. That balance may ultimately determine whether Traore's economic revolution becomes a lasting model for Africa or another ambitious experiment that struggles under pressure from both inside and outside the continent. What Ibrahim Traore is doing in Burkina Faso has become much bigger than a mining policy. Across Africa, many people now see him as the symbol of a new generation demanding stronger control over African resources and African wealth. Supporters often compare Traore to Thomas Sankara because both leaders speak about sovereignty, self-reliance, and economic independence. Instead of presenting gold as only a business issue, Captain Ibrahim Traore has turned it into a national symbol tied to dignity and survival. That message has spread quickly across Pan-African communities and social media platforms. Many young Africans believe their countries remained poor for too long, while foreign companies benefited from Africa's gold. oil, uranium, and minerals. Traore's rise has forced many people to ask a difficult question. Who truly owns Africa's wealth? For supporters, Burkina Faso is attempting to break an old system where African nations exported raw resources while outside powers captured most of the profits. Whether Traore succeeds or fails, many believe he has already changed the political conversation across the continent. Still, the challenges facing Burkina Faso remain enormous. The country continues fighting insecurity, economic pressure, and limited industrial capacity. Resource control alone cannot guarantee prosperity. Burkina Faso will still need strong institutions, transparency, infrastructure, and long-term economic planning. Even so, Ibrahim Traore has already become one of the most influential political figures in modern Africa. His government has transformed gold into a symbol of Pan-Africanism, sovereignty, and economic resistance. Today, Burkina Faso stands at the center of a growing continental debate about ownership, independence, and Africa's new economic future. Many within the African Union now understand that the future of the continent may depend on whether African nations can control not only their borders, but also the resources beneath their soil. And for many supporters across Africa, that future may already be beginning in Burkina Faso, with Ibrahim Traore. Just hours after the European Parliament adopted a resolution criticizing Burkina Faso, the government of Captain IbrahimTraore responded with a move that immediately captured attention across Africa and beyond. Instead of issuing a routine diplomatic statement, Burkina Faso summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a direct message. The country expressed its disappointment, its disapproval, and what officials described as profound disgust toward a resolution they believe was built on misinformation and outdated assumptions. At the center of the controversy lies a simple but powerful question. Who gave the European Parliament the authority to judge a sovereign nation that is not even a member of the European Union? According to the resolution, Burkina Faso faces worsening security conditions, shrinking civic freedoms, and growing humanitarian challenges. European lawmakers argued that large portions of the country's territory remain outside government control and warned that instability in the Sahel could threaten the wider West African region. For many observers in Brussels, this was presented as a concern for democracy, human rights, and regional security. But in Ouagadougou, the reaction was very different. Officials argued that the resolution ignored the sacrifices made by Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in their ongoing struggle against terrorism. They insisted that the document relied on inaccurate information and reflected a mindset that many Africans increasingly reject. What began as a parliamentary resolution quickly evolved into something much larger. It became a debate about sovereignty, dignity, and the right of nations to determine their own future. And as tensions rose, one thing became clear. This was no longer simply about security or human rights. It was about who gets to define reality for Africa in the 21st century. The response from Burkina Faso was not delayed, cautious, or diplomatic in the traditional sense. Within hours of the European Parliament's resolution, the government summoned the European Union ambassador and delivered a message that left little room for ambiguity. Officials in Ouagadougou argued that the resolution was based on inaccurate information and failed to reflect the reality on the ground. More importantly, they viewed it as an unacceptable intrusion into the internal affairs of a sovereign nation. During the meeting, Burkina Faso's foreign minister made a point that would become the centerpiece of the country's response. Burkina Faso is not a member of the European Union. Therefore, the European Parliament has neither the authority nor the legitimacy to position itself as a judge over Burkina Faso's domestic policies, security decisions, or management of civic space. The government also challenged the credibility of some of the claims presented before European lawmakers. According to officials, the parliamentarian who introduced the criticism relied on figures and assessments that did not accurately represent the situation in the country. They questioned how such sweeping conclusions could be made about a nation that many of its critics had never personally visited. But the strongest language was reserved for what Burkina Faso described as a lingering neo-colonial attitude. Officials argued that the resolution reflected an outdated belief that African nations must constantly justify themselves before Western institutions. In their view, this approach ignores both national sovereignty and the sacrifices being made by countries fighting terrorism under extremely difficult conditions. The message was clear. Burkina Faso would not accept external actors defining its political reality or dictating its internal choices, whether one agrees with the government's position or not. The response marked a significant moment in the country's foreign policy. It signaled that under IbrahimTraore, Burkina Faso intends to confront criticism directly and defend its decisions on the international stage without seeking approval from foreign powers. One of the most controversial aspects of Burkina Faso's response was its decision to bring NATO and Libya back into the conversation. For officials in Ouagadougou, the current security crisis in the Sahel cannot be discussed honestly without examining the events that unfolded more than a decade ago. In 2011, a NATO-led military intervention contributed to the collapse of Libya's government under Muammar Gaddafi. While supporters of the intervention argued that it was necessary to protect civilians, critics have long maintained that the operation created consequences that spread far beyond Libya's borders. According to this view, the fall of the Libyan state triggered the movement of weapons, armed groups, and experienced fighters across vast areas of North and West Africa. The fragile security environment that followed created opportunities for extremist organizations to expand their influence throughout the Sahel region. For Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, this historical context matters. Their leaders argue that today's insecurity did not emerge in isolation. Instead, it developed through a chain of events that involved decisions made by powerful international actors years earlier. This is why Burkina Faso reacted strongly when European lawmakers criticized the country's security situation without acknowledging what officials describe as the deeper roots of the crisis. From their perspective, it is unfair to discuss the consequences while ignoring the causes. Supporters of this argument believe that Western governments should recognize their share of responsibility for the instability that followed the collapse of Libya. Critics, however, counter that, regardless of past mistakes, current governments must still be judged by their ability to protect citizens and restore stability. The debate remains highly contested, but it has become a powerful political tool across the Sahel. By linking today's security challenges to earlier international interventions, Burkina Faso shifts the conversation away from immediate criticism and toward a broader discussion about accountability. As a result, the dispute with the European Parliament is no longer just about terrorism or governance. It has evolved into a debate over history itself, and over who bears responsibility for one of Africa's most persistent security crises. While the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament may appear to be a diplomatic disagreement, many observers believe a larger transformation is taking place across the Sahel. At the center of that transformation stands the Alliance of Sahel States, commonly known as AES, bringing together Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. What makes this alliance different is that it was not created merely as a security arrangement. It represents a political statement. The three governments have repeatedly declared that they intend to reduce external influence over their domestic and regional affairs while strengthening cooperation among themselves. For decades, Regional security strategies in West Africa relied heavily on support from foreign partners, particularly France and other Western countries. However, after years of continuing instability and growing frustration among local populations, leaders in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger began pursuing a different path. The creation of AES signaled that shift. The alliance seeks to coordinate military operations, improve border security, and develop common approaches to economic and political challenges. Supporters see it as an effort to create African solutions for African problems. The alliance has also taken symbolic steps that demonstrate its long-term ambitions. These include discussions on common institutions, increased economic coordination, and policies designed to strengthen regional integration outside traditional frameworks. Such moves suggest that AES is not intended to be a temporary response to a crisis, but rather a new geopolitical project. For European policymakers, this development creates new uncertainties. A region that was once strongly influenced by Western partners is increasingly making decisions independently. For the governments involved, however, that independence is precisely the objective. This broader context helps explain why criticism from the European Parliament triggered such a strong reaction in Ouagadougou. Burkina Faso did not view the resolution as an isolated statement. Instead, many officials saw it as part of a larger struggle over who will shape the future of the Sahel. Whether AES ultimately succeeds or fails remains uncertain. What is certain is that it has already changed the political conversation across West Africa and beyond. Beneath the diplomatic language and political arguments lies another issue that many analysts believe is impossible to ignore: resources. The Sahel is not only a region facing security challenges, it is also home to some of Africa's most valuable strategic minerals, resources that have become increasingly important in a rapidly changing global economy. Burkina Faso is one of Africa's major gold producers. Neighboring Niger possesses significant uranium reserves that have long contributed to international energy markets. Mali is emerging as an important player in the lithium sector, a resource essential for batteries, electric vehicles, and future technologies. For supporters of IbrahimTraore and the broader alliance of Sahel states, these resources are at the heart of the current struggle. They argue that for decades, African nations exported immense wealth while receiving limited benefits in return. As a result, many citizens continue to ask a difficult question: how can countries rich in natural resources remain among the poorest in the world? Traore has built much of his political message around that concern. He frequently emphasizes that national resources should first serve national development. According to this vision, gold, minerals, and other strategic assets must contribute directly to infrastructure, education, healthcare, and economic opportunity for local populations. This message has helped transform IbrahimTraore into more than a national leader. Across parts of Africa, he has become a symbol of a new generation of leadership focused on sovereignty, self-reliance, and economic independence. His speeches are widely shared on social media, and his image increasingly resonates far beyond Burkina Faso's borders. Supporters view him as a leader willing to challenge long-standing power structures. Critics argue that symbolism alone is not enough, and that lasting success must be measured through tangible improvements in security and living standards. Regardless of where one stands, Traore's growing influence helps explain why developments in Burkina Faso attract so much international attention. The debate is no longer only about one government or one country. It has become a discussion about who controls Africa's resources and who ultimately benefits from them. At its core, the dispute between Burkina Faso and the European Parliament reflects a much larger debate that extends far beyond West Africa. It is a debate between two competing visions of governance, legitimacy, and international responsibility. From the perspective of many European policymakers, raising concerns about human rights, democratic standards, and security conditions is both necessary and justified. They argue that governments should be held accountable when freedoms are restricted, humanitarian crises deepen, or instability threatens neighboring countries. In this view, international scrutiny is not interference, but part of a broader commitment to universal values. Burkina Faso sees the issue differently. Officials in Ouagadougou argue that no external institution has the right to dictate how a sovereign nation should manage its internal affairs. They maintain that security challenges, political transitions, and development priorities must be addressed according to national realities rather than foreign expectations. For them, sovereignty is not a symbolic concept. It is the foundation of independence. This difference in perspective explains why,